Welcome to Talking Points. My name is Dr. Stephen E. Gardner, and I'm here to share with you another series. A series that's focused on something that we all need to take part in from time to time. This series is entitled Self-Care and Service. And we're going to be involved in any type of work that's working with people, or whether you're just doing an everyday job. You got to find some time to engage and delve into what we understand to be self-care. If we've been burning the candle at both ends, pretty soon there's going to come a time that there will not be enough candle to hold the flame. There will not be enough wick to sustain the proper lighting that a candle is supposed to provide. And many of us who are caregivers, spiritual caregivers, pastors, or helping professionals find ourselves from time to time to where we become exhausted doing something good on the behalf of others. So we have to take time to replenish our storage, as it were. We can't feel that I can just operate on the anointing. As long as the Spirit of God is upon me, I can go miles and miles and miles. And that might be true. In many cases, we have all, sensed that greater presence of God to enable us to do the things that we normally could not do. And I'm not knocking that. But at a certain point in time, we must operate at a level of common sense. And that is, we need to take time and come apart for a while and rest. So this series is going to be focused on self-care. We're going to be looking at self-care and service. We're going to talk about today, we're going to give an overview of what some of the things that are associated or that are contrary to self-care, and to hopefully build an understanding from a broader perspective, from an academic perspective, on what the antithesis of self-care is, or things that lead to why we should take care of ourselves. So part one, we're going to talk about the power of rest, dealing with the body. Part two, we're going to talk about the power of reflection, dealing with the soul. And part three, we're going to talk about the power of renewal, dealing with the spirit. So let's delve right into this particular topic, and let's see exactly what we can learn today. Here's a quote by Elizabeth R. Krim, and it states, "As healers, many of us have felt a sense of being called to this work. We are often intrinsically fulfilled through our healing efforts and our attunement to others." Now, this is a powerful statement, especially for those who are called to some helping professionals, such as mental health professions such as nurses, social workers, counselors, educators, caregivers, and especially clergy. We have all been referred to at one time or another as a healer. Maybe you provided a listening ear, active listening, or maybe you had a compassionate presence. Or maybe you had a word that consoled someone, that helped a person heal right where they were. And so therefore, you have been at one time or another been classified or recognized as a healer. And that's okay. Yes, we can enjoy working with and helping people, and at times we are intrinsically fulfilled by this type of work. However, at other times, the healer needs healing. Those who are called must take the time to focus on the one who is called. There are times that the healer needs healing. We, or those who identify themselves as being called, whatever that calling is, even if it's just as simple as being called to be a parent, or called to be a foster parent, or called to be a caregiver, or whatever the case it might be, we need to take some time to focus upon healing the healer. So this series is focused on the most important part of the work of those called to any healing profession. Simply vocations for everyday life. Obviously, we've already implicated ministry. And it's also directed toward those who have volunteered or have called upon to be caregivers. Self-care has to be embodied by everyone that finds himself in the role of some sort of caregiver, whether they're a spiritual caregiver or whether they have a loved one whose health is compromised and you're the one there to provide for them. Whether you're providing for them or whether you're providing for them or someone else is providing for them, whoever is making the provision has to take time out for self-care. Sometimes it might be some unfortunate situations where you might be the only one in that family, and you want to do the right thing on behalf of your loved one. Yet, at times, you're going to need respite. At times, you're going to need to have some physical relief to replenish your storage, to enable you to have the kind of refreshment that can only come from physical rest, taking time apart from that which is essential on behalf of someone else. So what is self-care? First of all, it's the practice of taking action to preserve or improve one's health. That's taken right out of the Oxford Dictionary. Self-care is any action where we are intentional about caring for our psychological, emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being. Self-care is about having a good relationship with oneself so we can have a good relationship with others. As I said earlier, if I have burned the candle at both ends, soon there will be no more wick to sustain the flame. So again, self-care is any action that we are intentional about that's directed toward our own psychological, emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being. These are things we all have to engage in, no matter if we're just simply an everyday believer that works, whether even if we're retired, we still got to take time out for ourselves. Or whether we find ourselves in some helping profession, such as the ministry or a social worker or some other form of a healthcare professional, we all have to take the time out to care for one's self. Now let's talk a little bit about the psychology of self-care. The term self-care emerged as a global and highly generalized umbrella for the multitude of interventions for and prevention of compassion fatigue, burnout, vicarious and secondary trauma. And there are loads of types of activities that we can either adopt or either learn from, that are in both the secular dimension, there's also in mental health recommendations, and also in types of spiritual practices. And that would include yoga, tai chi, qigong, meditation, and mindfulness. That also would include incorporating the right kind of nutrition. You can't, for example, you just can't survive on junk food when you're burning the candle at both ends. Now, I've been guilty of it. Too busy, you got to get to an appointment, or you got to sit down and work with people and help them process through some things, and I didn't get the proper nutrition. So what did I do? I go to a fast food joint that does not even give me all the nutrients that I have. Small wonder when later on that day I don't have the energy that I would have had I given myself the forethought and maybe made the kind of meals or snacks that's a little bit more healthy, that will enable one to sustain the kind of nutrition and energy when we're engaged in caregiving activities. So nutrition is important. Breathing, taking time out to just breathe and learning how to follow your breath, learning how to do those kinds of exercises and those kinds of things that maybe some of us had never thought to engage ourselves in. And here's a big one: exercising. How many of us have already made New Year's resolutions, and I'm going to go to the gym? Well, the question is, how many times have the gym saw us this year? So we've got to exercise, even if it's no more than just walking, taking time out for just you. Obviously, taking vacations. All of these are powerful examples of self-care. Self-care, on the one hand, has become a steady drumbeat in the lives of those who attend to the care, education, prevention, and healing of others. Well, let's talk about three things that kind of overlap, but they all are different and present themselves in many different ways in many different ways that require an individual to do some self-care. So I'm going to talk about the psychology of self-care, and I first want to focus on compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress, and burnout. Well, let's break some of this down. Another name for compassion fatigue is secondary traumatic stress. STS is the emotional duress that results when an individual hears about first-hand trauma from another. STS, or secondary traumatic stress, is the emotional duress that results when an individual hears about first-hand trauma of another. So the development of STS is considered a common occupational hazard in the helping professions, and it's different from burnout. Burnout, on the other hand, is also a common occupational hazard and can be experienced in any work profession. However, compassion fatigue, or STS, is only experienced in helping professions such as social workers, nurses, and non-professional caregivers. And I would include within that, the ministry. Compassion fatigue is the physical, emotional, and spiritual result of chronic self-sacrifice and or prolonged exposure to difficult situations. Let me say that again. Compassion fatigue is the physical, emotional, and spiritual result of chronic self-sacrifice and or prolonged exposure to difficult situations. The outcome of that is that it renders a person unable to love, nurture, care, or empathize with another person's suffering. Such fatigue causes the sufferer to lose the ability to experience satisfaction or joy professionally or personally. You can always tell when a person has reached that plateau, or you can evaluate when you've come to that point of compassion fatigue. It might be the fact that, oh man, I got another person I need to talk to. Oh man, I'm just tired. And so you just kind of go through the motions. You don't really engage. Or that when they're talking, you're just like blah, 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 blah. You really don't hear what they're saying because you are already, you burnt out for that week. Come on, pastors, y'all know what I'm talking about. And you just don't want to listen to someone else's problems. Or maybe you've been caring for someone and it's just another person that you got to care about. Well, you might think, well, golly, to even have these kind of thoughts or have these kind of ideas, surely there's something sinful about it, or surely there's something wrong with me. No, all of these things are just simple manifestations of a need to take time out to care for oneself, to prevent compassion fatigue, or when you are experiencing it, to recognize it. Oh, time out. Let me schedule in some self-care. We just can't get up in the morning, take off in the evening, and then go to bed at night, and then the whole cycle. You have to take some time out. You got to be intentional enough to really give yourself a time out, to pull yourself off the game of life and set yourself on the bench of self-care. When we experience this kind of fatigue, as has been noted here, there's a loss of the ability to experience satisfaction. In other words, you get to the point to where you don't really enjoy what you're doing anymore. Hence, to pastors, and some of us that are pastors or clergy, maybe now we can understand why some people that may have flourishing congregations, large congregations, sprawling campuses, have come to the point that they want to quit. And if you look at that, you say, well, they got everything going for them. But when we enter into a phase of clergy burnout, which we'll talk about in a little bit, or compassion fatigue, you lose the satisfaction and the joy that comes with the calling or with this kind of caregiving activity. Compassion fatigue is not pathological in the sense of a mental illness, but it's considered a natural behavior and emotional response that results from helping or desiring to help another person suffering from pain or some type of trauma. Now let's talk a little bit about clergy burnout. Clergy experience a large number of stressors in their work, which includes role overload and emotional labor. And some of the signs of clergy burnout can be identified from Maslach's burnout inventory. Now you can go look this up. Some of you that want to take this a little bit further, you can go look up Maslach's burnout inventory, or MBI. And in there are three aspects of burnout identified in the MBI. And they are emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal accomplishment. Maslach went on to describe burnout as a psychological syndrome of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced accomplishment that can occur among individuals who work with other people in some capacity. Now, it is clear that clergy work is work that engages with other people, and it engages with people whom the clergy person deeply cares about. However, when clergy burnout begins to set in, or when it does set in, that individual begins to experience symptoms such as impaired job dissatisfaction, absenteeism, decreased productivity, reduced organizational commitment, impaired physical health. Now, that is one outcome of clergy burnout that, we probably could really spend a lot of time on. That if I don't take care of myself, my body is going to break down in other areas, and therefore I'm going to be forced to take care of myself. It also, when clergy burnout sets in, there's a reduced quality of life, and in some cases, a loss of purpose. Well, why am I doing this? Or, I didn't get into the ministry for all that. We come to that point to where we begin to say things that people will be shocked if they heard us think that or say those things. And many of those symptoms are just simply aspects of clergy burnout. And so you also, there might be some periods of loneliness. Your self-esteem has been lowered. It can also cause marital conflict. Not only will we take time out to rest, but we need to take time out with our family. And we that are in the ministry can get so caught up in caring for the needs of everybody else, and we forget about, or we overlook, or we get so distracted by caring for others that we overlook the real needs in the household. One of my early pastors and mentors said these words: a man cannot minister beyond the strength of his own home. And if you don't have a family, your initial home is you. If you do have a family, we need, in our self-care, we must include some time for what we call family care. And so some of these things, do come into play. There may be a substantial loss of closeness, enjoyment in relationships, both personally and professionally. The job description of clergy is diverse, and it includes leadership roles that involve constant engagement with others. Clergy roles have been grouped into 6 categories. You got a preacher, deliverer of rituals and sacraments, pastor. Let me also include in there chaplain, teacher, organizer, administrator. And taken together, these roles involve highly diverse competencies with numerous stressors. Clergy must frequently transition between roles, and sometimes, many times during a single day, resulting in what? A potential role overload. One particular writer said, and they proposed that there are 4 essential ministry stressors for clergy and their families. Personal criticism. Oh yeah, that's definitely a stressor. If you're on the front line as a clergy person, one of the things that you're going to encounter that comes with the cross, and that is personal criticism. Somebody going to talk about you. And so sometimes being talked about can lead to a place to where you get sick and tired of being talked about, and you're not doing anything to care for oneself so that you can become desensitized to, some of this criticism. And so you begin to internalize it, and it begins to affect how you see yourself, and you begin to get fed up with the work that you're doing that's very good for the kingdom of God. Can I get an amen? And so personal criticism, another thing that that's a stressor that can lead toward clergy burnout is boundary ambiguity. And that's just not only to the pastors, but it's also to other helping professions as well. We got to know where to draw the line. Hello, you can't do everything for everybody. And you got to take some time out to realize, wait a minute, I can't go another further. And you have to realize that and recognize that so that you can schedule some time. Secondly, sometimes that so the lines don't get blurred, so there's no ambiguous boundary manifestation. Learn to delegate. Learn to send someone else that can actually act on your behalf and trust them to do it. Now, in sending that, you want to send someone that's qualifiable, obviously. And so that's something that if we don't have it, that is a plan that we can involve ourselves in, how to train up people that you can delegate certain responsibilities to, so you don't get overloaded or you don't get too involved with people's lives. You cannot become someone else's Holy Spirit. If you feel if it's all about you and it's about what you're trying to impart upon other people, you've already crossed the line. You already got boundary issues. It cannot be all about you. It has to be about the needs of others. But then there's a appropriate distance and appropriate involvement that we should be thoughtful of when we are engaging in some sort of interpersonal relationship with those we're trying to care for, so that there is no boundary ambiguity, so you'll know where to start and where to stop. And then it could also lead, one of the other stressors is presumptive expectation. Now, y'all know the story. Everybody expects the pastor to do this, the clergyman to do that, and we put them on a pedestal. And when they fail and make a mistake, oh boy, all hell's broke loose. And there we are, we're quick to condemn and not quick to forgive. Now, I'm not excusing people that are in the ministry that do things that are sinful or things that are flawed. But the idea is here in this context that sometimes clergy burnout can lead to these kinds of breakdowns in areas of morality and other kind of areas of one's life. And then obviously family criticism. Honey, you're spending too much time at the church. Honey, you need to, you need to cut it off at a certain point, And so we got to listen. Or again, Johnny's not getting the proper time, or Susie's not getting the proper time for the kind of activities that are family related. So clergy burnout can be preempted by any of these stressors as well. Now, I know that there's a lot more that can be said about clergy burnout, and I'm trust that, that there be along this line, there's been some self-reflection, which we're going to talk about the next week. But today we want to talk about the power of rest. Because in order to really get to the point of having the kind of physical refreshment so that I can be available to people, not only emotionally, but mentally and spiritually, I got to get some rest. Now, Jesus, this principle was presented in a couple of verses that we can find in both the Gospel of Mark and also in the Gospel of Matthew. And I want to invite you to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verses 30 and 32. And in the New Revised Version, it says these words. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. So we can see that they had gathered around Jesus and they began to, give an after action report, as it were. They began to tell Jesus all that they had did and all they had taught. So they had been busy doing and teaching. And listen to the most powerful words that came from the Messiah. And he said to them, come away to a deserted place all by ourselves and rest for a while. Or all by yourselves and rest for a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. Doesn't that sound familiar? And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. And it's important that you take the principle out of that. Because the opposite of that, if you read on a little bit further, happened while they were on their way. What happened? Some people found them and cut them off. So the idea is that when you choose to take time to engage in the proper rest, make sure that you can do it in a way to where, that you don't get ambushed like they did there in the gospel. But the principle is that we all need to take time apart for a while and rest. That's what the King James verse said. Come apart for a while and rest. We got to have that physical replenishment that can only come through either sleep or slumber. And the last verse I want to talk about today is Matthew 11:28. And it says, come to me, all you that are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Let me go on to say this. Even though Jesus is talking about rest for the soul, sometimes if we don't get rest for our body, we're never going to get rest for our soul. Like the Psalm 23 that says, the Lord's my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me by the still waters. And when I get there, he restores my soul. So sometimes that place of repose, that place, whether it be, to take a weekend off, you know what I mean, or whatever it might be, or take some time out. I know that I was talking to one of my pastor friends the other day, and we discussed about how that the Lilly Foundation each year has this clergy retreat that you have to apply for. And, the idea is that even the academic world and the world of health professionals and clergy associations recognize the need for those who are caring for others from the pulpit to the pew have to have time to rest. And so getting into a place of physical repose also enables me, like a retreat, also enables me to get the kind of nourishment to my soul. Jesus said, come to me, you that are weary and heavy burden, and I'll give you rest. And he says to take my yoke upon you. Well, wait a minute. If I'm already carrying a heavy load, if I'm already carrying a heavy burden, if I'm already yoked down, I can't take on Christ's yoke unless I'm willing to give up mine. And so there's an exchange of yokes here where I give up my yoke and I take on his. And the result is we find that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. Well, I trust that you've been blessed with part 1 of self-care and service. Today, we focused on just a little bit of the power of rest, dealing with the physical and the bodily aspects of rest and how that, in essence, helps us to care for ourselves and prevent compassion fatigue, clergy burnout, or even secondary trauma stress. God bless you. I'll see you again next week as we'll talk about the power of reflection in part 2 of self-care and service. Have a great week.